Probably have a rush of people coming in a few minutes that are just getting off the teaching. But to get this done in time, we need to get started. I've got a couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to talk about first. Remember to sign up. We've ordered the Kindles. They're in the mail, and so remember to sign up for this. And then another topic, a number of you brought up that we should put some things on our website, some teaching tools, some links to places, and we think that's a great idea, but it's a little bit slow in the update. And we think that a wiki might be a better application for this, and then everybody gets to participate. So to kick this thing off, I'll put something out on email, but I'm going to ask for, well, let me ask you here. How many of you have created a wiki? One wiki. How many have actually worked with one? Have interest in creating or working with one? Not much. Okay. I tried. And so what we're going to do is we'll find another audience that's more interested in wikis. Okay, I understand. Anyway, we will put some things in the short term on the website, but in the long run, there are so many things, so interactive. A wiki would work, I think, perfectly. So I'm going to ask for some help to figure out the categories. You don't have to know anything about wikis, but what do you think ought to be on there? So I'll put out an email. Be looking for an email that says, could you tell us some candidates for categories for things about teaching and increasing teaching excellence, online teaching, things like that, so that we can get people assigned just to get the starter kit, so the rest of us then can fill in the detail. Okay.
Can I add just a little thing?
Please do.
You may already have said. One of the suggestions that one of the new faculty gave to the Teaching Academy was to be able to go online and find articles, say, on a good syllabi.
That's just what we did.
Okay,
right.
Great.
That's why
we're addressing that particular thing in the same way.
Right. Okay. So we're very lucky today. This is going to be a musical day. We're going to start with Dr. Cox, Dr. Earnest Cox, who is a Little Rock native, and so is Frank Thurmond. Wow, you guys left and went all over the world and then came back to us. Some of us aren't from here, but we welcome you back. So, Dr. Cox is going to take about 20 minutes or so to talk about music in his classroom. And then we've got some planted questions, but even on top of those planted questions, I'd like to encourage. It's been painful getting questions out of you in the past. So I'm encouraging you to think about the questions you might ask as you're listening. Dr. Cox?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us. And Frank and I were just talking about our histories, and it turns out that we had a common music director. The teacher who taught me music was actually one of his important music teachers, and we didn't realize that until today. What I want to talk about today is how I use music in both my rhetorical theory courses and also in my composition courses. And I don't consider myself to be a practicing musician anymore. Once upon a time I did, as Frank and I were talking about, but I've always just enjoyed music, and as a graduate student, when I had problems connecting with my students, I just decided to start bringing in music to try to get them, at least keep them awake. And so that led to actually considering how popular music could be used to teach rhetorical concepts in the composition classroom, which was my dissertation topic. So I have a handout here for you. And I wasn't sure how many to make, so we might have to share. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about how I use music to help illustrate the 3 classical persuasive appeals. These appeals were presented formally by Aristotle, and they pretty much set the foundation for a lot of what we consider to be classical rhetoric. one of the problems I've run into is when you have students who are not that familiar with the classical ideas or not interested in the ideas. I've always sort of run into problems trying to make it relevant. Well, music allows us to do that, allows me to do that. And so what I want to do, I wasn't exactly sure how many people would be familiar with these terms, so I just want to go through the terms, and then I want to basically demonstrate what I would do in class, and have you all participate as though, you know, you were my students. First, the classical appeals, there were three. The first was ethos, which dealt with character and credibility of the speaker. It's the idea that sometimes it doesn't really matter what the person is saying, it's more who is actually saying it and whether or not you trust that they would be telling you the truth. So ethos was the first appeal. The second is logos, which is the appeal based on reason, based on logic. Aristotle tends to focus a lot on logos. He sees it as being the most important, or the one that the rhetor should strive to use the most. But he also realized that, you know, human beings are not completely logical. And this leads to the third appeal, which is pathos. And this dealt with encouraging or playing to the emotions of your audience. When I teach these concepts, a lot of times students, if they understand each concept separately, sometimes they don't really understand how they work together. And what happens is that even though Aristotle has separated these three ideas, they tend to blend. And so one of the questions that I ask my students is, what is the relationship between these concepts? How do they complement each other in a persuasive text? And I think using a piece of music allows us to actually see how they work together. And because I have limited time here, I'm only going to focus on two of the appeals. I'll focus on logos and then on pathos. What I do is to basically just bring in a song. And it can be any song. I try to find out what the students are interested in. And you know, if they're into Lady Gaga, then bring in a Lady Gaga song. If they're into B.B. King, bring in B.B. King. Doesn't matter. It, you know, works with any type of, I guess, lyric-based song. And what I do is to basically show how you can illustrate and understand logos and pathos just by listening to something that you're already familiar with. For example, logos. Logos, the actual word, means word. So what we do is look at how the lyrics are carriers of logos. You know, they're carriers of meaning. And what I'll do is to print out the lyrics of a song, hand those out to my students, and then just ask them to brainstorm, to answer these questions. What are your interpretation of meanings and your thoughts about these lyrics? And I picked a song by the band Goldfrapp called Lovely Head. Anyone familiar with the band? No? Okay, so you know, here's something new today. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to just take a look at these lyrics and then, just in general, tell me what this song is about. So I'll give you a couple minutes to read over that and just give me some of your thoughts, your ideas on this.
not sure about this gold frat person.
Well, what do you think? What do you think? No, this is it. Well, and part of what I point out with this is that just looking at the lyrics by themselves won't really give you the total picture. In the same way that in rhetoric, just dealing with logic by itself really doesn't take into account all the possibilities that are available for persuasion. So yeah, looking at these lyrics, you go, well, okay, there seems to be something going on here. It's pretty vague, it's pretty short, like someone said, where are the rest of the lyrics? You know, and I chose something that was pretty brief here, just to show how you can get some meaning from the lyrics, but not all the meaning, okay? Usually students will, you know, of course, just fill in the blanks. You know, any empty spaces there, they'll just come up with things and personalize it and do all sorts of things. But what I want to do is illustrate that's just one aspect of persuasion. The second aspect, which takes us to the second page, has to do with pathos. And for this exercise, we can look at the music itself as being the carrier of emotions. And this particular exercise works best if I can find a song where I actually have the instrumental version of it, and I'll actually play the music for them and say, okay, what thoughts come to mind? What images? What feelings do you get from this? And then we put those together and talk about, well, how does the music help to give meaning to the words? How do the words help to give meaning to the music? And usually they are able to understand this. They're able to really comprehend how, even in their favorite music, they can separate and understand the lyrics from the music. And by doing that, I'm also then illustrating these rhetorical concepts. So what I want to do now is just play a little bit of the song for you, and then get some of your reactions from it. And then I'll, you know, open it up for questions. Okay, the screen is going off here, so how do I? There's the view. Here we go.
to sleep and dream over easy. No one but me. So cool, you're hardly there. Why can't this be killing you?
Okay, give you a taste of it. So now that you've heard the music and the lyrics, what are your impressions of the song? Okay.
First, it reminded me of a love song. Then it sounded French, and almost as though the language you were speaking didn't have to understand it. It sounded like a foreign language coming in. And then it was like a love song, a little bit of rock. A little bit of rock. So that was my impression.
Okay, good. Good. Anyone else have either a different impression?
The dark meaning of it?
Julie said it.
Any others?
Well, it seemed to me that the lyrics and the instrumental portion were from two different songs. If it was just the instrumental part, it feels like it's about headaches.
I got more of a murder and suspense feeling out of that.
James Bond.
Yes, I heard James Bond. I heard a James Bond goal.
Well, and one of the things that I try to illustrate with this whole exercise with the students is not only giving your impressions, but then asking those questions, well, why do you have that impression? You know, why did it remind you of James Bond? Why did it remind you of headaches? You know, or a mystery? You know, because then you're getting them to, as writers, not only think about how they're reacting to what's being presented, but some of the techniques that were involved to get that reaction. So, you know, if you're talking about pathos, you're talking about emotions, and you want your audience to feel sad, well, what makes you sad? What images, what ideas, what concepts would make you sad? Then how can you use that with your audience? Or if you are presenting, and the third appeal that I didn't put on the handout, ethos, has to do with character. You know, when you're listening to this song, what do you think of this person? As you said, this gold frat person has some issues. So, you know, that's ethos, you know. So all of this, I hope, will allow my students to become more comfortable with these concepts. It also, I think, allows us in the classroom to bring in materials that the students are familiar with, so that, you know, gold frat is something I enjoy. I probably wouldn't bring it in for my students. I would pick something more contemporary, so that they could see that rhetoric is not only something that we're dealing with in our classroom, but it's something that they are faced with every day. Even when they are just relaxing, just listening to a song, that they, if they wanted to, can turn on that analytical part of their brain and say, okay, now, why does this song make me feel this way? How is that, you know, a demonstration of pathos? Okay. So, any questions or comments about this before I sort of transition into Frank's presentation?
One question.
Sure.
I took a course from Dr. Payne in the secondary education department this past summer, and she suggests I look at a website called Lit Tunes. And in it, the creator of that website has taken contemporary tunes and put them with classical literature pieces. And what you're talking about there, it seems like it would lead to that also. So you're going to take a look at that site.
Okay.
Littunes.org or com, I'm not sure which.
Littunes.org.
Yeah, L-I-T-T-U-N-E-S.
Okay.
Excellent website. Interesting, like we'll take the Catcher in the Rye, there's 10 songs that represent.
Different parts of.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's that?
Littunes, Littunes. It's either .org or .com, I'm not sure which. So you have to try both of them. It's going to go. If you put Littunes in, it's going to come out. Google Littunes, it'll come out.
Well, and I have an interest in, since I was a kid, an interest in musical scores. And it's probably one of the reasons why I tend to drift towards this type of music, because it has that sort of cinematic quality in the music. And so it seems as though what they're doing there is constructing scores and soundtracks for literature. So you're sort of combining, is that what they're doing?
No, these are popular songs we already know.
Okay.
These are songs we already know, like a Beatles song that they might attach to a piece of literature, so they can compare a song we've all heard to a piece of literature we've all seen and see a different relationship.
Okay. I'll look at that.
Did they strip the words off the Beatles song that they play the music for?
No, all they do is he just lists the songs and go listen to the song. So the tunes aren't really on the site, but it does give you the list.
Okay.
He's done hundreds of things.
One of the things that we like to do at the end of these is talk about how what Dr. Cox talked about could be transferred into our classroom. So can you see any ways that you might be able to use something like this in your classroom, apply it to your content?
I was just wondering, with this one, how do you break down the argument?
Well, the argument, what I try to do as far as defining logos is just say, okay, what is the point of this? Just the literal point. It's not a formal argument being presented, although you will find some songs that do that. Just on the base level, I say logos is just really literal meaning. So this one is a little vague. It leaves a lot for you to interpret. Some other songs, are pretty straightforward. And it's those songs tend to be a lot easier to say, to really explore logos. But today I wanted to sort of primarily shift toward pathos in the presentation. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay, other ideas? How might you use this in your own classes?
I've got a direct, I teach marketing and advertising. When we talk about a marketing campaign, we're talking about persuasion. We can just take this directly and use it. And you can talk about whether, for example, a jingle that's used in a marketing campaign or an advertising campaign. We've all seen commercials that have logical arguments to them, and then we've also heard how music is used as a peripheral cue. We take that and use it as a more recent model, the elaboration likelihood model, as we were in education of persuasion. Centrally processed information is one way to persuade someone to take action, and in this case, purchase a product. But then the peripheral cues in music is usually a peripheral cue that engages the consumer's emotions or puts them on it, encourage them to make decisions based on how they feel about something rather than what they think about it.
Right. And how many of us have had a jingle stuck in our heads? You're in Target or whatever, you see the product and you go, hey, I remember that song. That might be enough to get you to try the product.
Yeah, we have.
I've used Neil Diamond's They're Coming to America on my sociocultural foundations course. Because, why they're coming to America, for all the immigration reasons, and get into a debate about that, pros and cons.
Anyone else? You see anything you can take away from this that perhaps use in your classroom?
Well, I teach business law, and one topic is intellectual property and stealing intellectual property. And a rap group tried to get permission to record by Roy Orbison. Orbison said no, and they did it anyway. And so I will play both versions in class, and so we're talking about fair use and parody and all that. And the difference between those two songs, I may ask, how many of you have heard of Roy Orbison? And most of the white students raise their hand. And then I'll ask about Luke Skywalker of this rap group, and a few of the black folks will raise their hands. But and then some will know both. But surprisingly, there is that distinction. And then I point out that this went to the United States Supreme Court as a 5-4 decision, that it was a parody, so they could do it. But and part of the reasoning was that it went to a different market, so to speak, that there was that difference. So in one sense, that is using a song, but not in the analytical way that you use it, but in showing the intellectual property issues that are involved.
Well, we wish we had more time to explore this in a little greater depth, but we do have one more speaker today, and we'd like to thank Earnest Cox.
When Frank and I we met last week to talk a little bit about how we were going to do this, we started thinking about, well, how can we connect, and what is the connection between rhetoric and music and rhetoric and literature? And we thought about it, and we came to the myth of Orpheus. If you all remember, Orpheus was the poet whose wife died and went to the underworld. And Orpheus decided to go to the underworld to basically persuade Hades to release his wife. Well, he's always thought of as the poet and musician, and what we realized was that he was also a rhetoric, because he was using not only logic, but he used pathos. He used his music to enhance his argument. And if you all remember the story, he got his wife, but he was told that he couldn't look back where he did, and then he had bad things happen to Orpheus later on. So with that, I guess I'll give it to Frank.
Thank you.
Okay. Another Little Rock native, Dr. Frank Thurmond, has been offshore to Greece and to England and back, and to Europe and back several times. Are you here to stay?
I hope.
Good. Well, we're interested in exactly what it is that you're going to do today.
All right. Well, I do have a hand
I
up.
will pass these out.
Thanks very much. So first of all, I'm honored to be asked to speak to you, and a particular pleasure that came out of this was simply making the acquaintance of Ernest. And just a moment ago, just before we got started, as Ernest mentioned, I'm still processing this, that we found we had the same high school music teacher, and really the person that I owe, to whom I owe with my discovery of music and my desire to keep with it and to enrich my life through that was a gentleman named Lorenzo Smith, who taught for a long time at Little Rock Public Schools, and at the time I was at Hall High. I graduated in '85 and Ernest '86 from Parkview, and he had studied with Lorenzo earlier, and so I'm very much indebted to Mr. Smith, and it's just the fact that we shared the same musical mentor and then found ourselves here today sharing our interest in music with you. That's phenomenal when you think about it, and it'll take a little bit more time to process that. So a particular interest of mine is the relationship of music and poetry, specifically in Renaissance poetry and drama. And on top of that, specifically English Renaissance poetry and drama. And to set the tone for that, I wanted to look at a sonnet that really encapsulates the relationship between poetry and music, the way it was seen. And this was something that in the Renaissance was a rediscovery of classical ideas, as we'll consider in a minute. But just as I would do with my students, who by now would have studied the sonnet form and know all about it, I'd like to ask if someone would like to volunteer to read this sonnet out loud, get us started. That's just the usual response I get. So I think I'll call on someone. Dr. Minnick. You're the reason I'm here doing this, so it's only fair.
If music and sweet poetry agree, as they must needs, the sister and the brother, then must the love be great twixt thee and me. because thou lovest the one, and I the other. Dowland to thee is dear, whose heavenly touch upon the lute doth ravish human sense. Spenser to me, whose deep conceit is such as, passing all conceit, knows no defense. Thou lovest to hear the sweet melodious sound that Phoebus' lute, the queen of music, makes, and I in deep delight am chiefly drowned, whereas himself to singing he betakes. One God is God of both, as poets feign. One night loves both, and both in thee remain.
Thank you, very well read, and you definitely get extra class participation points for doing that. So now I'd like to analyze this a little bit. First of all, I'm wondering if any of you recognize any of the actual names that are mentioned in this song. Any names stand out? Spenser, Elizabethan poet, author of The Faerie Queene. What about Dowland? Does that ring a bell for anyone? John Dowland was the chief Elizabethan lutenist. And we'll talk about the lute in a minute, but the lute was an instrument that was everywhere in Elizabethan society and was seen as being connected to the ancient Greek lyre. So it is symbolic of this relationship between poetry and music. And in many ways, music was seen as a rhetorical form. I mean, music theorists of the time speak of music in terms of rhetoric, in ways that Earnest was talking about. So if music and sweet poetry agree, as they must needs, the sister and the brother, siblings, then must the love be great twixt thee and me, because thou lovest one and I the other. So the convention here, you have the young man wanting to woo the lady and trying to find this common connection. Poetry and music is off to a good start. Dowland to thee is dear, the lutenist. Now we know immediately she loves music, whose heavenly touch upon the lute doth ravish human sense. Spenser to me, whose deep conceit, and conceit could mean a number of things, including wit, imagination, is such as passing all conceit, and there's the pun on conceit, needs no defense. All right, so at first it's, you wonder, okay, she likes music, he likes literature. Thou lovest to hear the sweet melodious sound that Phoebus' lute, and there's lute again. Phoebus. Phoebus Apollo, the Greek god of poetry and music. And there's that ancient idea of poetry and music, the same God as God of both. That Phoebus' lute, and that's what he played. In this conceit, the god of poetry and music would have played a lute, which is described here as the queen of music, and what it makes. And I in deep delight am chiefly drowned, when as himself to singing he betakes. Now Ernest has just introduced the idea of Orpheus being the great poet-musician of old, and music and poetry being interconnected. And here it is. You love it when the lute is played, but I love it when singing is made with it. And Phoebus is being equated, Orpheus is so ubiquitous in society that you could see Phoebus, Apollo as being synonymous with Orpheus. The idea of the great lutenist and singer in one. So the same function. One God is God of both, as poets feign. One night loves both, and both in thee remain. Now, there might seem a dichotomy here in their interest, but even though she loves music and he may be completely tone deaf, nevertheless, because poetry and music are interrelated, then so should their love be. And that's the argument the poet's making in the sonnet. And this encapsulates this whole feeling of how the two are interconnected. So I want to talk a little bit about Orpheus. Now on the handout, just below this, you have an illustration, and this is actually from the edition of the Metamorphoses by Ovid that came out in 1582. It was very influential. And here it is. Classical awareness led Renaissance artists to depict a Greek lyre. And again, for Elizabethans, the lute was synonymous with the lyre in its function and even, they imagine, in its sound. So Orpheus is, the importance of Orpheus in the Elizabethan concept of both poetry and music as rhetoric, is very important to keep in mind here. And this is illustrated in a song, a Shakespearean song, on the next page. One of my interests is Shakespeare's use of music in the plays, in terms of both the songs, how that are used, and the ballads, and the tunes. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I just want to look at this. Here's from the play Henry VIII, Queen. Take thy lute, wench. My soul grows sad with troubles. Sing and disperse them if thou canst. Leave work. And then we get a song. And it refers from the beginning to the idea that Orpheus was able with his music to move inanimate objects as well as people. Orpheus with his lute made trees, and the mountain tops that freeze bow themselves when he did sing. To his music plants and flowers ever sprung, as sun and showers there had made a lasting spring. Everything that heard him play, even the billows of the sea, hung their heads and then lay by. In sweet music is such art, killing care and grief of heart, fall asleep, our hearing die. And that connects the two as well, because you hear him, he's playing, and they hear him sing. You have both references here. They bow, you have the lute and the singing together, and there's a perfect illustration of how Shakespeare sees Orpheus as someone who, through both music and the rhetoric of singing, was able to effect a profound change on people. And again, the trees, the ocean, stones. And just beneath this, there's an illustration of Queen Elizabeth I herself with the lute. Now, you know if Queen Elizabeth is playing the lute, then it's taken seriously. It was seen as an essential, music was seen as a key ingredient of education, and that goes back to classical terms. Aristotle talks about that, Plato. And this is, again, something that was rediscovered. So, I mean, young men would be expected, if they wanted to win the heart of a lady, they better turn up under her balcony and sing her a song, or at least hire musicians who could play the lute to come while they would then sing. You get that illustrated in Shakespeare's plays, in The Two Gentlemen of Verona. And there's a song, Who is Sylvia? What is she? In The Taming of the Shrew, a lutenist, you have a man disguised as a musician with a lute, and he comes out with the shrew cape, smashes the lute over his head. And some performances actually show him coming out, and he's got a lute smashed on his head. And, and that then becomes a symbol of discord. The lute itself, you can see in the picture, right where her hand is, it's called the rose. And this elaborate carving in the lute symbolized the harmony that the lute itself symbolized. And so the lute itself, when it's played in tune with all its strings, is seen as symbolic of the harmony of the music of the spheres. But if it was out of tune, or if a string broke, that was symbolic of the discordant nature of society. The lute is often used in so much poetry as a symbol of all aspects of society. Richard III speaks of in his disdain for the average man, playing the lute, playing the lascivious lute. Get to thy lady's chamber and play the lascivious lute. So I love that description of the lute. It can be seen as something, a means of seduction. Now I wanted to just look at the ways in which the Elizabethans rediscovered this classical knowledge, this classical idea of music and rhetoric, and incorporated it into society. There's a quote here at the top. This is from the Republic of Plato. Musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace, and making the soul of him who is rightly educated graceful, or of him who is ill-educated ungraceful. Now let's compare that with a passage from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, where the two lovers literally hear lute music playing on a moonlit bank and wax poetic. And then Lorenzo comments, therefore the poet, and he's speaking of Ovid from the Metamorphoses, therefore the poet did feign that Orpheus drew trees, stones, and floods, since not so stockish, hard, and full of rage, but music, for the time doth change his nature. And you can see right there, you can compare that with the song from Henry VIII, where Shakespeare makes the same reference. And here in another play, calls attention again to Orpheus and his power over not just people, but trees, stones, and floods. Lorenzo goes on to say, and this really ties in clearly with the ancient art of music and rhetoric. He then says, the man who hath no music in himself, nor is not moved by concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted. Mark the music. And when he says dark, his emotions are as dark as Erebus. Erebus is the darkest night in Hades, where, as Ernest pointed out, Orpheus goes to retrieve his lost wife. So that's the very darkest place in hell, and a person who doesn't appreciate music, who doesn't have music in himself, is not to be trusted. And that goes straight back to the Platonic idea. George Putnam, a contemporary author, wrote in The Art of Poesy, poesy is a skill to speak and write harmonically, and verses or rhyme be a kind of musical utterance. So there it is again, a reference to this feeling that music and rhetoric are intertwined. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about how important music is in Shakespeare's plays, or should be. How important it was in the original productions of Shakespeare's plays, and how I would argue it should be used, and is often, usually not, in contemporary productions. You have to keep in mind that music was everywhere. The lute was everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds of ballads were performed by people from every class, high and low. Hundreds were known, the lyrics were known, the tunes were known, and you'd have the plays, when you went to a play, you'd have music before the play, during the play, after the play. And in Shakespeare's plays, there are countless, almost, references to ballads. Hundreds of ballads are mentioned. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this, but a character will just throw a reference out to a ballad, and the audience then would have known. They would have heard that ballad tune in their head. Just think if you went somewhere and you heard someone refer to, in a line, maybe on TV or watching a show, and someone mentioned the Beatles yesterday. Almost everyone in here is going to immediately hear yesterday, hear that song. You know it, and that's the way it was with them. So when we go to a Shakespeare play now, that's lost. That whole musical context, which is a key part of the original performances of plays at the time, is lost on us, and they'd have to work really hard to bring that back. So that's something to keep in mind. And so what I do in the classroom is I play some music, and I'll show certain passages from Shakespeare's plays, certain ballads, and then play the tunes so that students can get an idea of how it really would have sounded, and hopefully understand how the performed on the original instrument, with the original tunes at least, really add a lot to the rhetoric of the drama. And one thing I do in my literature classes is point out all the way through. I go chronologically and start with Gilgamesh. And was delighted to find recently that a lyre, the same type of instrument, was found during an archaeological dig at the city of Ur in ancient Samaria. And on it was carved scenes from Gilgamesh, which indicates that the very first epic in literature that we have would have been chanted and sung, the way that later the Psalms were. Psalm, in fact, means not just song, but songs performed with musical instruments. Then they refer to the lyres. The Homeric epics, chanted and sung with the lyre. Beowulf, sung by an Anglo-Saxon scop or minstrel in the halls. So it's a long tradition. So I plant that idea from the start. So by the time we get to the Renaissance section, I can then bring out a lute, which I actually have. So excuse me while I whip it out. So you may have actually seen the lute depicted in paintings. In fact, oddly enough, one of the only times I ever heard a lute performed was when I was a student here at UALR. I was here and came here in 1985, and Michael Karenbauer, who's still in the Fine Arts Department and teaches music and taught guitar then and still does, brought in Paul Odette, who is still today considered the most famous lutenist. He's the best. And he came and performed at the auditorium at the Fine Arts Building. I got to hear it, and that planted in my head this desire to play the lute. I was studying classical guitar, loved Renaissance music, played it on the guitar, but I thought it's somehow not real, it's not authentic. So I always wanted to do this, and it wasn't until many years later when I studied in England that I was able to borrow a lute from a museum and take lessons on it. Then had to leave it there, and then 10 years without one, and then finally out in California, of all places, found another one. So it's not an original. There are no surviving lutes, but we know a lot about how they were made. Luthionists at the time, luthiers, we still use that term for people who make guitars and other instruments. Luthiers wrote about how they constructed the lutes. We have the paintings, and we have writings about the technique. We have paintings that show that picture from of Queen Elizabeth. You can see how she's playing it, or how her hand is held. They always had their pinky finger held against the instrument while they played. So that in itself is nice, but I also make an attempt to play a bit, and that usually goes down pretty well. You know, just, if nothing else, it's just a break from the discussion. So I wanted to give you an example of some of these. Now on the back of the handout, I have first of all a little piece in Hamlet, for example. Brad and I went to the lecture yesterday at the Clinton School about the upcoming Hamlet production, and we heard a lot about how the philosophy behind that production, and heard from the actress who plays Ophelia. I wanted to ask the question, but didn't get it off in time, what they were going to do with the music. Because whereas there's not a whole lot of music in Hamlet, there's a very important part in the middle where when Ophelia appears in her madness, just around the time Laertes comes back from France, she's singing snatches of old lays, as Gertrude later described it after she dies, after Ophelia is found dead. So she's singing, and we have some clues in the text about what tunes would have been used by Ophelia. The tune of Walsingham, for example. So here's one of the little things she sings from a ballad of the time, and I will attempt to play a melody that seems to fit with it. There are only a few instances in all of Shakespeare's plays where we actually know with some certainty what the tune was. Have a quick look on the previous page in the handout, where I've included an actual contemporary manuscript. It was A Lover and His Lass, and this, by Thomas Morley, seems to have been written specifically for that song, written by Shakespeare, and used in the original production of the play. Now you also get, by looking at this, an example of how the lute music is written in tablature. It's the music underneath, where you see these weird-looking signs, the letters. It's written in tablature, where the letters indicate the frets, which frets and which strings. So A on the top is the top string. C is the third string. Or third string, third finger. Second finger, third string. Don't get me confused, I won't be able to play it. But anyway, that gives you an idea. The lute was the first instrument for which Western music was written down, long before bowed instruments were ever created. So you had this huge repertoire of music, and the lute for several hundred years dominated. And the lute evolved over time. I usually get a lot of questions from students about, what the lute is and how it's made, and why this neck is curved or funny like this. So those will be some good questions to say from just after the presentation. So please do think of some questions about the lute. But I'll just say for now that the lute evolved over time, and later by the Baroque time, had so many strings they either had to add another neck. This is the type of lute that existed around 1600, the time Hamlet would have been performed. So you might read the lyrics along while I do this. Are we running out of time?
No, no.
Well, we are getting towards the hour, so I was going to give you several pieces, but I'll just give you an example. I won't try to do this whole piece, just to save some time, but I was talking with Chris yesterday about the ballads and how important they are in considering Elizabethan culture, and remembered that there's this particular song called Fortune My Foe. And this song is very dark, very melancholy. It's often associated with the lute, that name, that term, melancholy. And the song was often performed at public hangings and executions, being drawn and quartered, this is what you heard. So, Fortune my foe, why dost thou frown on me? And will thy favors never better be? Wilt thou, I say, forever breed my pain, and wilt thou not restore my joys again? So I'll give you an example of how that would have sounded, more or less. I mentioned tunes that would be known to audiences, but there's one tune that you would probably recognize. And again in the handout, you have this reference to one that everyone now still knows. Mr. Spord from the Merry Wives of Windsor. But they do no more adhere and keep place together than the 100 songs to the tune of Greensleeves. So that one tune, you might hear in a play and then be able to hear it. But that gives you an example. There were hundreds of tunes like that everyone in the Elizabethan audience would recognize. But immediately it gives you that musical context. And so you probably know the melody, or you might know it as What Child Is This? Any questions about the lute itself? Someone's wondering why this is there. That's the fret nut would have been held in place with the strings, and so you had to have the tension to keep that in place. So it had to do with the tension of the strings, and so you got this odd configuration. So otherwise, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've heard that Greensleeves is attributed to King Henry VIII. Is that true?
Well,
did he write it?
I don't know. I believe that's a theory. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I don't know. I haven't heard that theory before, but I know where we could look to figure it out.
I've seen it attributed in the literature.
I mean, I can see it was definitely popular in his court, but I don't know that it was this. I don't know that he wrote it.
I mean, we know he did write some tunes and wrote some poetry, but I believe that's just just theory, but there's no evidence. But it was popular in his time.
How many strings?
All right, so this one has 15 strings, because each they're called courses. Each one of these is a course, and they're all doubled except for the highest string. And these strings are unisons, but then these are octaves. So in that, that Fortune My Foe, I'd really like to end with this heavy, but you're getting both So it's 15 altogether. Just before this, there was the 6-course lute and the 7-course lute, which which had 13 strings. This is an 8-course lute, 8 courses, but only one string is single, so we've got 15 strings. And as I said, they kept adding on. By 1610, you had a 10-course lute, and the strings just kept being added. So by the time Bach writes the lute suites, it's a completely different instrument. You couldn't play it on this because you wouldn't have enough strings. Not Bach for you. Yes.
Now, what's the material these days? I'm sure it isn't.
Well, I mean, this is
Animal hair, no, in the strings.
well. This is like a classical guitar string. It's nylon. This is silver plated. Now you can actually get gut strings. Now there's a line in Shakespeare I particularly love. That is it. After hearing the lute, someone says, "Is it not strange that sheep's guts should so hail souls out of men's bodies?" And I plan to get actual gut strings, but I know that sounds odd, but for the sake of being authentic, I'm going to order gut strings, and so next time I play, I'll be playing gut. I'll play from my gut. See, too much Shakespeare, and you can't resist even bad times. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. As we always do, we ask